Oh, 2020, what a year you have been. Yeah, it's been a weird one this year, hasn't it? But you know what? It is now officially 2021 when this video goes live, meaning that we have successfully navigated 2020 and come out the other side stronger, possibly, maybe, and as a reward, I think the best thing that we could do is a video all about the best games of 2020. Because ultimately, while other media has kind of struggled to navigate the issues of 2020, gaming has not really let up at all. In fact, it's been quite a year for games. There's been all sorts of things all over the place, as we've geared up for a new generation, among other things. And I have actually played a lot of games this year, a lot more than I feel that I have done in previous years, which I'm honestly quite impressed by myself for that. It's been a bit of a strange one for games, though. There's definitely a feeling that the coming of the new generation has affected things in a sort of significant way, as AAA games never quite won me over in the way that I expected them to, but there's been an awful lot of really weird and quirky indie games doing really unique and interesting things, and this video is going to celebrate all of that. But I feel that just taking the best games of the year isn't good enough. I'm actually going to do something slightly different, and I'm going to present to you every single game that I have played from this year, and I'm going to rank every single game from worst to the best. Now, for the most part, I'm going to skip through and offer sort of a very brief thought on what I thought of each game. But for the top 20, they're going to get a little bit more focus, sort of like the top 100 games of the decade thing that I did last year, but nowhere near as massive as scope as that one, because I'm not spending 3 months making this one. Dear God, no. Anyway, so yeah, without further ado, I think we better start with the stuff that didn't quite make the top 20, from the game I liked the least to the game that just missed out on that top 20. Let's go. Did you ever play Hyperlight Drifter and think to yourself, man, I really want to play this, but slower and less charming? Well, congratulations, Fallen Angel exists. This is just straight up a knockoff of Hyperlight Drifter, but nowhere near as good. And I haven't even played Hyperlight Drifter, so I can't directly compare, but even just watching gameplay, I can tell it's not very good. I didn't enjoy this game. Ugh. The Falcon here is a game with big ideas and absolutely terrible execution. And I really hate saying that, because this was a solo effort, and unfortunately just camera issues, unsatisfying combat, a really empty and uninteresting world, and also just a lot of really poor signposting in things like tutorials just really put me off this game. I did a full review of this actually, and yeah, I was not kind. The Almost Gone is a really bland puzzle game that I wanted to like a lot more. It sounded really intriguing, and it made me think of Monument Valley, which is a really good mobile puzzler if you haven't played it. But this one just... the story, I'm not really sure what's happening in it, and the puzzles are kind of weird and obtuse, and it just wasn't really a fun experience, unfortunately, so I would avoid this one. The White Door had the potential to be much higher than this, because it's got an interesting concept, and it does some weird things with puzzles, but it's interesting enough to keep going. The main problem is, and the reason why it's dropped so far down the list, is because most of the story is hidden off in a separate ARG. As a result, you're left with a lot of questions by the time you finish the game, and honestly, if you weren't part of the ARG, you're missing out on a lot of stuff here, and that's really bad. I don't like roguelikes, I really don't, and Scourgebringer is further proof of this. Mechanically, I love this game. It's got a really satisfying gameplay loop of you fighting off all these things with sort of slashes and trying to maintain your momentum in the air, but then you do it for room after room after room after room after room of the same thing over and over again. And when you die, you've got to do it all over again. I don't like roguelikes. I don't like them. You know how I said I don't like roguelikes? Here's Skull the Hero Slayer, another game with really interesting mechanics. You play this little guy who's the skeleton, he's got a head that you can swap out for different abilities. That's cool, I really like that idea. It's a shame that all the levels are procedurally generated, and it's just not really that fun to play long term because it just gets really repetitive. You kind of go through a lot of the same areas over and over, fighting the same things, and this is what I don't like about procedural generation and roguelike type games. Continuing the theme, here is BPM, Bullets Per Minute, another game with a ton of really interesting mechanics. This is a first-person shooter in the vein of things like Doom and Quake, but you do it to the rhythm of the music, and it's great. And then it's all a procedurally generated dungeon, and at one point, one of the dungeons was an entrance hall, a weapon shop, and a locked door that I could not open. That's why I don't like procedural generation. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Do you know what I didn't expect to like as much as I did? The Peaky Blinders Mastermind game. So I played this for a review. It's not a game that I would play normally. I know nothing about the show, I've never seen it. But it's actually a pretty solid strategy game. It's kind of bogged down by being a licensed property that feels like a half-assed mobile game, but ultimately it's actually pretty decent. If they had like a good story and they had more levels that kind of really delved into what these systems could do, this would be a really good game. Unfortunately, it's not very good overall. I played Battletoads out of nostalgia, playing one of the Battletoads games back in the NES era, and yeah, I played this and was immediately struck by how terrible the writing is. They've tried to do like a whole like Saturday morning cartoon, we're coming back after 20-something years kind of thing, and none of the jokes land at all. And then the combat is decent but gets very repetitive, and then they throw in a bunch of wacky levels like, hey, let's do Toad Shambo, which is rock paper scissors but wacky. It could have been good, but they leaned too far into just being plain stupid. Lena's Inception is a really solid Zelda clone. It's very Link's Awakening in its execution, and for that, I really like it. Where it kind of falls down a little bit is our old friend procedural generation. You see, the world is created at random when you load the game up, and as such it makes it not a very fun world to explore, as like a lot of it's dead ends with nothing in it and stuff like that. And if they'd have just put the meticulous level design that Nintendo do for their Zelda games, this would have been really good. Return One Way Trip is a pretty decent point and click horror adventure that I really quite liked. It's not perfect, it's got some issues with tedious backtracking, and its plot doesn't really feel resolved at the end. Not to spoil it, but you know, I really did not like the ending of this, and for a story that had me invested for most of its runtime and a lot of interesting concepts around it, it was kind of disappointing that it kind of just fizzled out at the end. But you know, sometimes that happens. But I'd recommend it maybe if you're into this sort of thing, but be aware it's not going to be super great. Doom Eternal disappointed me so much because it so desperately wanted to be Dark Souls, and that does not work in Doom. Every enemy's got very specific weak points, and then when they throw the Marauder in, where you've got to be a specific distance from him at all times, or else he just becomes impossible, made me just quit, because I just could not be bothered with it. And I loved Doom 2016, it was great. And this one just tried to do too much and fell flat for me as a result. No Straight Roads is another big disappointment for me, and it just falls out of the top 20 as a result. Yeah, so I've done a Ferret's First on this, and you saw how I was kind of excited for it, but ultimately the rhythm gameplay doesn't really fit very well with the game it's trying to go. Honestly, the aesthetics, the writing, the music, all of that, great, love it. It's a shame they forgot to put much of a game in here, because it's really short, doesn't really do much, and the rhythm stuff is just broken and isn't there. Coffee Talk is a really chill experience that I enjoyed quite a bit. If it wasn't a visual novel and had a bit more interactivity, I might have liked it a lot more, but it is a really nice little chill vibe that it's got going for it, and really interesting characters and stuff. You're just in a cafe serving coffee to fantasy creatures, and it's a nice little time. I wish it was more interactive, but that's just me. It is just a nature of its genre, unfortunately. And now, here is the top 20. Please enjoy. Lena the Shadow Dust is a really sweet little point-and-click adventure. It's not super long, it's not super complicated, but it's very appealing. It's made with this very hand-drawn aesthetic. I don't know if the animation's actually hand-drawn or not, but it kind of looks like it is. Like, it's all very traditional animation. Some beautiful scenes. The characters are really charming. The whole thing's done without dialogue, so it's very much a visual treat with the music as well playing around. And yeah, it's a really simple point and click. It doesn't really do a lot of complicated stuff with its storyline or with its puzzles, but the puzzles are really interesting. They kind of play around with different aspects of the world. So you've got little cute creatures that you have to interact with, and you've got the two different playable characters. You've got this boy with a rabbit hat, and you've got this really cute cat ball thing. And they've got different abilities and they interact with the world in different ways. Like, the cat ball has little powers that come into play as you go through, and he can interact with the shadow and things like that. And that's a really cool little mechanic. And you just engage with this weird magical tower, and it's very surreal and very dreamlike, but it's really sweet and it's really nice. And again, it's not a very long game that might put people off in that sense, but for the experience it gives, it is very much like you're kind of solving your way through a little Ghibli movie. And yeah, it's really nice. I mean, it's got a cute little cat ball guy as one of his characters. How can you not like it? Come on now. Come on now. Hotshot Racing is one of 3 retro throwback arcade races that caught my attention this year. It basically throws back to like your Daytona USA, Virtua Racing, that kind of thing. You can kind of see it in its aesthetic. It's very low poly, very bold, very colourful, very much like you can just see that it's taken a lot of inspiration from those old Sega arcade races. And gameplay-wise, it has done very much the same thing. This is a very fast-paced, drift-heavy, gotta use boosting kind of racer. It's very, very arcadey. It's not going for anything resembling realism at all. But it's a really, really fun experience. You've got a variety of different bizarre little characters, and the gameplay is just really, really fun to get on with. It's just such a fluid, easy to get into racing game, one that is surprisingly difficult when you play single player, as the AI is incredibly aggressive and you're just trying to like jostle for position at all times, and there's very rarely a point where you kind of get way ahead of the pack and all that. And I quite like that. I do think that it's a little bit limited for single player, but I think its strength really lies in being a solid multiplayer game. So, if you're looking for something that is just a really fun, easy to pick up multiplayer racing game, Hotshot Racing really does scratch that itch really well. I really enjoyed this game. So much fun to play around with. Cyberpunk is quite in this year because of, a certain game that recently came out, but it wasn't the only cyberpunk-themed game to come out, and here is Cloudpunk, another very kind of dystopian future, sci-fi kind of thing, and it's actually a really interesting experience, I think. It's a game about being a delivery driver in a city, in the clouds, in the far-flung future. It's very neon-drenched, and the visuals are very kind of voxel-based, so it's all 3D, but like everything's kind of a little bit jagged. Everything kind of looks a little bit like it's made out of Lego to a weird degree, which I'm totally down with. You play as this delivery driver who, it's her first night on the job, and the company she works for, a little bit shady, probably doing some stuff that is not necessarily on the level, and you definitely encounter a lot of that as you go through the game, and some of the customers you work with are not trustworthy, I would say, and there's a few little decisions you've got to make here and there throughout the game. There's not a lot to do in the game. It's basically just driving around and walking around, and then you interact with a couple of things here and there. The draw is the story, which is really good. I have not finished this game yet, so I don't know how it all pans out, but at the point in the story that I'm at, I'm very intrigued about what is going on. There's a lot of implications about the AIs running the city not being 100% functional, and some things happen to cause that, but no one really knows what it is, and it's all really interesting. And it's such an interesting little game, because the point of it is to just kind of explore this world, this visually striking and really well-written world that has a lot to offer, I feel. Not necessarily as engaging as that other Cyberpunk game, but I definitely recommend this if you're looking for something a little bit more plot-driven. Art of Rally is the second of the 3 throwback arcadey racer games that is on this list, and it's a pretty good one. It is a rally game. Basically think Colin McRae Rally meets Micro Machines. You can kind of see the Micro Machines similarity just from this footage. It's the top-down, tiny little car kind of thing, but it's all very minimalist, real-world locations, I guess, is the way to look at it. And that art style is actually one of the main things that sort of drew me to Art of Rally. It's very minimalist, but very bold and very colourful, and it sort of stands out. And the game even knows this, because there's a free roam mode where you can drive around these places without, worrying about winning a race or anything. And there are points where you can just sit and watch the scenery, and that's just the thing it does. And okay, fine, game, whatever you say. But apart from that, it is a pretty solid rally game. It's probably not going to beat the likes of Dirt or anything like that in terms of quality, I don't think. And honestly, it took a while to kind of get used to the controls when I first started playing it. But once you get used to it, it's a really fun little rally game. That's best to play in sort of small bursts. I found that playing it long term wasn't very good, but these short bursts and doing a stage here and there, it was really fun. I thought it was a good little rally game, and that's what I have to say about that, I guess. Resident Evil 3 is a superb remake of the original game, in that I don't like it as much as Resident Evil 2 that came before it. And this applies for both the remake and the original. Original Resident Evil 3, the Nemesis really annoyed me. I found it kind of got in the way of what was otherwise a pretty good game. Resident Evil 3 Remake has a few more problems of its own. It's not just the Nemesis that's kind of a problem. There's just sort of a general feeling of what made Resident Evil 2 good is sort of there, but not quite. And I think that's kind of why it's here rather than anywhere else. I still massively enjoyed it, because it's still got that sort of classic Resident Evil structure, for the most part. When it defaults to that and you're kind of exploring it in the same way that you would in Resident Evil 2, it's brilliant. It's the action set pieces that really kind of let it down. In particular, there's a section where you play as Carlos and you've got to fight off a horde of zombies. Hated that bit. Terrible. The lab that follows it, much better. Enjoyed that a lot more. But yes, it's an interesting one, because when you're kind of exploring around Raccoon City, or when you're exploring the lab, or you're exploring God knows where else, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, the hospital, yes, that's another one. Those are all really fun things, and I really enjoyed it. Even some of the Nemesis chases I actually preferred to the original, where Nemesis just kind of showed up and was obnoxious, and I was just like, could you go away please? Whereas they managed it a little bit better in the remake. So some of the chase sequences are kind of fun. It's more the kind of large scale fights, because they still maintain the Resident Evil limited ammo thing. But on the whole, still a pretty decent game, but massively flawed. Kunai is a really nice little Metroidvania thing. It's not going to win awards for originality, in all honesty. It's kind of very Metroidvania by the numbers, run around, go to this place, get an ability, and it opens up new areas and that sort of thing. It's still a really fun little game. It's a really fun platformer. Just the fluidity of it is really fun to play around with. And there's a lot of charm to it as well. The character is basically this little computer tablet thing, and its face is on a screen, and if you crouch down, it makes a happy little cat face, and it's like a cat, and that's adorable, and that on its own was like an excellent game. I approve of this. There's a lot of really fun movement mechanics, and they incorporate the weapons into that, so you can like use SMGs as a glide, because you're just firing downwards, and it kind of creates this weird sort of hovering motion. There's also, as the title suggests, Kunai, which you can use to throw, and that creates a grappling hook, and you can swing around all over the place, and that's a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed that. It's kind of largely overlooked, to be honest, and it's, again, not really doing anything new for the genre, but I had a lot of fun with this one. It's another one that I haven't quite finished yet, but I'm working on that one. But I enjoyed what I played of it. If you're just looking for like a really simple Metroidvania to play around in, and that's got good, satisfying movement mechanics and a really fun sense of charm, then Kunai is something I absolutely would recommend that you give a try. Tell Me Why is basically Life is Strange 3, but not quite as good, but still very, very good in many, many ways. It is about two twins, Allison and Tyler. Tyler is trans. It is important to the story because it's all reflecting on an event that happened in their childhood that led to the two being separated, and now they've come back together as adults 10 years later, I believe it is, and they're basically digging through their old house and trying to clear all that out so they can sell it. And in the process, it's digging up a whole load of old memories, and yes, it's one of those feelings games, I'm sorry, but it is actually very good. The writing is still very solid. If you played Life is Strange, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's maybe not as gripping as the Life is Strange games have been, but it's just because it's a lot more subdued. It's a lot more family drama. Let's think about things, but it's really well written, and there's a lot of really good choices, especially the way the twins bounce off each other. You can kind of choose to support each other or argue with each other and do all that sort of stuff. There's a lot of stuff going on with the townspeople, and you're trying to figure all that out. Yeah, it's one of those choice-based games where everything kind of all leads to the same place. Ultimately, it's just kind of the journey changes as you go there, but that's still pretty good. I really enjoyed the story of this one. I thought it was really solid. There were moments that sort of shocked me. There were moments that really kind of made me feel for the characters as well. There's definitely one point in the story where they've kind of got some very questionable language towards Tyler, again, who's trans, and I felt angry on his behalf and all that sort of stuff. And it was just a really good, solid time, I thought. And yeah, if you're looking for something sort of very story-based, very kind of slow, very drama-y, if you liked Life is Strange, you might enjoy this one. Inertial Drift is the third of the retro arcade indie races that I have played this year. Inertial Drift I thought was my favourite out of the bunch of them because it's basically an unusual racing game in the sense that you can only steer by drifting. That is the only way you can do it, because like the actual steering only really kind of moves you position wise on the track. It doesn't like turn the car too much. The drifting is what does it, and it's a really cool and interesting way of doing racing games, especially because you've got to kind of balance that drifting, which slows you down along with, you know, your usual sort of braking and acceleration and all that sort of stuff to try and get the maximum speed out of things. It's a really, really cool feature. It looks really gimmicky, but then you play it and you're like, oh no, this is really well thought out and there's a lot of cool stuff going on in here. It's basically like trying to solve a puzzle with every single car that you play in this game. You're trying to figure out exactly how to get the best out of it, how to time its drifts really well, and just it's a blast to just try and get used to all of this and to try and figure it all out. It makes it feel like more than just a racing game. It feels like, I don't know, a puzzle game with racing involved. It's a weird one to describe, but it's also got like a really cool, like cel-shaded look that really pops out, and I absolutely love this art style. I also like that it's got a story mode that actually kind of teaches you about the unique mechanics in a way that doesn't feel too overbearing, but also tells you exactly what you need to know in a way that I just found really sort of subtle. Like, if you lose, it kind of points you in the right direction to what you did wrong, and I really approved of that. Inertial Drift, excellent game, recommend it. So the low placement of this one is probably going to cause some controversy because, well, this is probably the most divisive game of the year, and the funny thing is I can sympathise with people who absolutely hate it, and I can also sympathise with the people who absolutely love it. Last of Us 1 was my game of the year for 2013, no questions asked on that one. That is absolutely my game of the year for that year. Last of Us Part 2, I was kind of reluctant on because I was like, they didn't need to make a sequel to this, and honestly, now that I've played it, while they've done an excellent job of putting all of this together, I also still feel like they shouldn't have made a sequel because it just doesn't land for me in the same way that the first one did. Like, I feel it lacks the heart that drove the first one so much. That's not to say it's a bad game. It just didn't click with me. I didn't emotionally resonate with it or anything like that. And that's kind of a problem. But there are some moments I really liked. The moment where you're sort of playing with the dogs, those bits are great. You've got bits where, you know, Ellie and Dina are interacting, and a lot of that's really cool. Like, I liked the beginning parts where, you know, those two are out scavenging and stuff like that. I really liked all that. I think some of the back and forth that goes on when they're in Seattle at the beginning of the game, that's really nice. I also just like a lot of the stealth stuff. I think they really refined a lot of the gameplay without the issues of pacing and without the issues of a lack of emotional core. I think this would have been higher. But as it is, this is probably as high as I'm willing to put it. Excellent game, but really fundamentally flawed story. So this year was a bad year to be a fan of Magic Schools, in the case of, like, the biggest one at least, because of, well, you know the whole situation there. Perhaps if you're looking for a Magic School that's a little bit more LGBT friendly, perhaps, may I recommend Iconfell, which is a really, really excellent RPG. Very small scale indie RPG, but it's really, really good. It's got a really nice little story and some really cool battle mechanics that are all about positioning, and they're all about kind of knowing how to kind of catch as many enemies in your attacks as possible and all that sort of stuff. Just, you have to really kind of get used to the quirks of each move. But in terms of the story, this is such an awkward game, and I mean that in a really endearing way. You know how when you're a teenager and everything is the biggest drama in the world and everything is the most important thing in the world, and everything's a little bit cringy and a little bit kind of, oh, we're trying to figure ourselves out and it's all a bit rubbish and, you know, you're not really all that cool when you're a teenager. That's what Iconfell feels like, but it feels sincere in its representation of that. It's not trying to be, hey, cool teens, hey, cool. It's just genuinely reflecting that kind of, we don't know who we are, what our place in the world is yet, but we're desperately figuring it out. But they're also trying to stop some weird magic stuff that's going on from happening so that they can save the world and save their magic school and all this sort of stuff. And it's just a really sweet little game, and I really enjoyed this game. It's just got a really nice cast of characters that, you know, it's not perfect in how it delivers a lot of its story. I think there's definitely improvements that could be made, but I think what we have is a story told with heart and with love, and it's endearingly awkward. Speaking of really sweet little indie experiences, Rocky, assuming that's how you pronounce it, I never know. It's a really nice little point-and-click adventure. It is inspired by Scandinavian folklore, and it is all about a girl named Tova who is living up in the mountains with her father and her little brother Lars, and Lars gets taken by this weird monster thing, and she ventures into this magic forest to go and save him, and it's very much a fairy tale in how it presents its story, and It is a point and click, so it's all just kind of running around trying to piece bits of the world together, just rubbing things on things until something clicks. You know, it's that sort of game. If you enjoy those sorts of games, this is a good one. Definitely go pick it up. But on top of that, there's a story that I really liked in this, and it was all about family, and it's a story all about how we treat our families and sort of the contrast between the villain and how Tova treats her brother and that sort of thing. It touches on themes of grief and loss with the father, who's kind of largely catatonic since his wife died. Not to spoil anything, but like how the events of the game shape him too. And it's all really, really nice. And the world itself is really magical, and it looks gorgeous. And just, you know, wandering around, you get to talk to trolls and interact with like all these other weird little creatures of the forest, and a lot of it just goes into some strange places, but it's in a way that you're just kind of like, yeah, I'm happy to go along with this. You know, I'll go talk to some giants and do whatever weird metaphysical puzzles they want me to do. That sounds like a good idea. And yeah, Rocky is a really, really sweet little game, and I definitely recommend it if you like your point and clicks. Carrion is a devious little game where you get to play as this weird, creepy alien mass of tentacles and teeth that is clearly not something that you would like to encounter, because it basically runs through this entire lab and eats everything in sight and destroys everything and just wreaks general havoc, and you get to play the monster, which makes this incredibly awesome. It is a Metroidvania where you get your various powers to mess with the humans of this lab. You can trap them in webs, you can stab them with spikes, you can ram into them. It's a free-for-all basically, and the objective is to just escape this lab that you've been trapped in, and it's weirdly satisfying to sort of slink around these passageways as this weird fleshy mass and just go ham on everything you encounter. It is gruesome, it is horrific, and it is delightful in the most evil way possible. It's the way that you can be creative with attacking the humans as well. You can throw things at them, you can thrash them around, you can devour them, you can do all this kind of stuff, and it's just all over the place. It isn't really the point. The point is escaping, increasing your powers, increasing your mass, and eventually leaving to wreak havoc elsewhere, I presume. But it's very violent, it's very aggressive, and yet the sort of very pixely look that it's got kind of prevents that from getting too horrific. But aside from that, it's just a really, really fun time that I highly recommend. You know about this one, I talked about it on a video. I did a whole video on why this game is rad, because World of Horror is rad. It is excellent. It is basically, you know, an RPG visual novel combination type thing. It's with a bit of roguelike stuff in there. You are an investigator, you are trying to stop an elder god from taking over the world, and you are basically just trying to survive this as your health and your sanity get affected, and the clock is ticking for the arrival of the elder god to devour the world and whatever, and you've just got to solve these little mysteries and things done through randomly generated encounters that you have, where sometimes you'll be fighting enemies, sometimes you'll encounter things where you've got to do a skill check, sometimes you've got to do God knows what, sometimes you just have stuff happen to you, and sometimes nothing will happen. Very rarely that one, but it does happen. And yeah, it's really simplistic in its presentation, but it's excellent all the way through. I absolutely adore this. The writing is brilliant, the creature designs are terrifying, and I think like the MS Paint look really does help with that. And yeah, it's just a fantastic game. It's still in early access, it's still having stuff being put onto it, but honestly, it doesn't feel like it to play it. It feels like a complete product, which is good, because it's excellent, and it's definitely one of my favourite games of the year, and I thoroughly enjoy the bizarre Junji Ito meets Call of Cthulhu setup that World of Horror brings, and I recommend that you can go and play this one if you haven't already. Fall Guys is one of those successful live service games that are quite rare this year. Most live service games completely failed this year, but Fall Guys is unique and interesting, and therefore it succeeded and became the feel-good hit of the summer until Among Us got popular. Among Us isn't actually on this list. I wasn't sure where to put things involving Among Us, so I might give it a spotlight somewhere else. Fall Guys is a lot of fun. It is basically Takeshi's Castle with adorable jelly bean people, and that premise alone sold me. And then the fact that it got released for free on PlayStation Plus sold me even more, because it meant I could just play it immediately and not have to spend some money. It's a really fun little game. It's really frustrating at first because you keep wanting to try and do well, and then you realise that's not the point. The physics engine on this is basically just meant to make you floppy and useless, and the whole thing's inspired by things like It's a Knockout and Total Wipeout, and the music also reminds me of Splatoon, so that's another benefit that it's got going for it. Like, genuinely, you could take that soundtrack and put it in Splatoon and no one would question it, or vice versa. I've never won a crown. I've not gotten that much. I haven't actually played it that much in the past couple of months, but it's definitely something that I do get the urge to kind of think, oh, I should probably play more of that at some point. I don't, because I'm bad with keeping up with multiplayer games, but it's definitely one that charmed me, and I definitely still love this thing, and that's why it's so high on my list. I went into Streets of Rage 4 expecting a fun little diversionary nostalgia trip after, you know, I mean, I say nostalgia trip because I played Streets of Rage in the last few years. I didn't play it when I was a kid, but, you know, it's like, I thought, you know, Streets of Rage and Streets of Rage 2 were really good, Streets of Rage 3 wasn't. I was like, I'm sure it would be just a fun little throwback to that, and that'd be just, you know, a bit of knockabout fun for a few hours, and then I played it and was like, I have to get good at this game. I didn't get good at this game because I never finished it, but it did instill that in me. It was like, I have to do this. I have to get good at this. I have to try and really get to grips with its systems. Like, it's really simple to pick up, but then you keep finding little things in its combat system, little intricacies, and you just kind of like, ooh, what if I try this? What if I did this? And there's a rabbit hole that you end up going down. And yeah, Streets of Rage 4, I ended up playing for a lot longer than I expected to. Like, I haven't put in 100 hours or anything like that. If you put in 100 hours into Streets of Rage 4, I would be like, how did you do that? The game's like 2 hours long, start to finish. It's kind of bizarre, but anyway. It's still a fun game, though. I absolutely enjoyed this. This was a really good thing. This is kind of like the Sega philosophy right now. It's like, let's take our old properties and then give them to an indie developer and let them just do what they want with it, because that's ultimately what they did with Sonic Mania, and it's what they did here. And in both cases, the game was excellent and really kind of highlighted what made the thing good in the first place, but also just kind of brought some stuff in that of its own that makes it stand out. Streets of Rage 4 definitely does that. The art style is really cool, and yeah, I got totally absorbed into Streets of Rage 4 a few months back and absolutely love this game. So, Crash Bandicoot 4 is the first Crash Bandicoot game that I have actually been excited for in 20 years of my life. So the last time I was excited for a Crash game was Crash Bash in 2000, and then I was massively let down by that. Then Crash Bandicoot 4 came out this year, and I was genuinely excited for it. And this time, I was not let down. It's a really fun game. It's Crash Bandicoot all over again. This feels like the original trilogy. The original trilogy are some of my favourite games of all time. They are just superbly fun, and they really do hold up to this day. Like, I don't even have the Insane trilogy. I'm talking about the original PS1 games, which I still have, and they are so much fun to this day, and I still enjoy them, and just the amount of times I've played through them, because they're so kind of quick to go through, I've played through them quite a bit, and to have Crash Bandicoot come back is just wonderful. It is not really doing anything new, but it is bringing back what made that series good. There's a couple of little things that they've improved and tweaked on. They've added a whole bunch of things that are brand new additions, but it's all building on what that original trilogy did really well. And yeah, it's just after Streets of Rage 4, which was the last entry. This is another really great retro throwback game that's got 4 in the title, that's just kind of capturing that essence of what made the series great in the first place and is bringing it back in a big celebratory way. And I adore Crash Bandicoot 4. It is really difficult, surprisingly so, but it's all within the spirit of those original games, and it makes me very happy to have this series back on top, where it belongs, once again. Here's another game that I've already made a video on about why it's rad. It is Animal Crossing New Horizons. In my opinion, the most important game of the year, without a doubt. It is the most important game of the year. Not necessarily the best game, but definitely the most important game of the year. I say this because, obviously it's been a rough year and it's been a bit of a mess all around, and not a lot of good stuff been happening this year, unfortunately, but I think as everything started to hit, Animal Crossing came out, and it provided an escape. It gave you a nice little island to go and explore and to call your own space, and you didn't have to worry about the things going on in the world. It allowed you to go and visit your friends on islands and pretend you're actually hanging out in real life, and that was nice for a lot of people. And you got to craft things, and there's all the fun little events going on throughout the year. There are definitely problems with its UI. A lot of people have talked about how Animal Crossing does kind of bog you down in a few things here and there. Like, it takes you 4 steps where something should really be taking 1. I think that's kind of just part of its sedate nature. It's not trying to it's kind of almost deliberately trying to slow you down. So you just take your time with it and enjoy this little world that you're creating around yourself. This has been a major game for a lot of people, I think. It has helped a lot of people through the hardships of the year. And for me, I just really liked building my little island and trying to steal all the landmarks in the world, which is an ongoing task, and I haven't played it in a few weeks, so, whoops. But yes, Animal Crossing, the most important game of the year, in my opinion. Okay, so this one, you might think, well, hang on a minute, didn't you do this as an advent calendar video? I mean, you probably aren't thinking that, because I know none of you watched it, but Crusader Kings 3 is kind of a late entry to this. I genuinely snuck it in at the last minute, and I really like Crusader Kings 3. I haven't played a lot of it, but what I've played of it, I'm just like, no, this is my game. This is something that I'm totally down with, without a question. This is excellent. This is amazing. I have no idea what's going on, but it's fun. Any game where I load it up and then I immediately accidentally marry 2 people, just straight out the gate, and they mutually accepted their proposals as soon as I put them out there, and I'm like, well, I guess I got 2 wives now. My reign was just sex fueled, as well as my 2 wives ended up with a lover and a romantic partner or whatever it was. And then when that king died, his son took over. And then I was like, okay, cool. Okay, what strategy am I going to use for him? What's his traits? How should I play this guy? And then within 10 in-game days, he died. So that was probably a couple of seconds. I was like, okay, cool. And then his sister, I think, took over. It was definitely not he didn't actually have a direct heir. He didn't have a son or a daughter. But it was a queen that suddenly took over, and of course then it was like, oh well, any child you have is not going to be part of this dynasty, and you're going to lose because of that, and it's because of the nature of succession. So suddenly I tried to bring feminism to Western Europe 10 centuries too early, and that was just how that went on. I kind of just snuck in at the last minute. I think I just managed to get that thing. But anyway, look, I married 2 wives by accident. Crusader Kings 3 is my 3rd favourite game of the year for that alone. And now we come down to the last 2. Here is what I've placed at number 2. Final Fantasy VII Remake is excellent. It is a superb reimagining of that original classic RPG from the PS1. Now you might be thinking, hang on, number 2, something was better than this? Yes. We'll get to that though. But yeah, what it's done right is it looks gorgeous, and it really expanded on a lot of things. It was really nice to get to know Biggs, Wedge and Jesse a little bit more, because they were kind of just extras really in the original game, and now they're fully fledged out characters, and I really liked that. Getting to learn a little bit more about just the characters in general, and Midgar felt like a real place. It felt like a real kind of slum city, whereas in the original game you kind of don't really get to see a lot of it because of just the pre-rendered backdrops and how everything's kind of a bit cramped because of memory issues and everything, so you just sort of see snippets of it. Now it feels like a city. Now it feels like a mega city, and that's a huge difference to how you feel about everything that's going on. It's just such a brilliant reimagining, even if it is just the beginning of the game, but also it really asks some questions about what it means to remake a game. It does things that you don't expect it to do, and it doesn't quite want to follow the path of the original game, and I liked that. It was doing its own thing and trying to be a little bit weird and off kilter. I mean, it's Nomura, so of course it was going to do that. Where I do have a problem with Final Fantasy VII, and this was the thing that kind of prevented it from being my game of the year versus the game that actually is game of the year, and that is the fact that too much of the game is filler. There are sections, particularly towards the end of the game, where you just kind of play through them, you're just like, is this necessary? Does this need to be here? Or is this padding to stretch the game out to 40 hours? And that was kind of a letdown. Otherwise, excellent, and is one of my favourite games of the year by far. But that filler content really dragged it down a little bit for me. But only just to number 2. But what is at number 1? It's Ori and the Bloody Wisps. I agonised over this decision over what should be number 1, and Final Fantasy VII was here at one point. But then after thinking about the filler content, I looked at Ori, and I went, I can't think of a problem I had with Ori. Everything about Ori is excellent in every way. I really enjoyed Ori and the Blind Forest. That was an excellent game. That was an excellent Metroidvania from a few years back. Really beautiful, really good score, and just everything. Ori and the Will of the Wisps built on all of it and made a game that was just superb. And I just cannot fault it. I can't think of anything I dislike about Ori and the Will of the Wisps. And in a year where almost every game I played, something stood out to me as like, I'm not massively into that, but it's otherwise great. Ori and the Will of the Wisps was just great. So that is why it takes the number 1 spot. It is a brilliant platformer. The movement in this game is just satisfying. There are times towards the end of the game when you get enough abilities where I don't think I was able to touch the ground because I was just bouncing off everything and staying in the air and just flying around and flinging Ori into things. Brilliant. Loved it. It is absolutely gorgeous. This game, the art design is just perfect. I love this game's art design. The score, beautiful, heartbreaking. More of this, please. Yes. And also one thing that I think elevated this game for me above its predecessor is that I felt the world was more alive. I never really felt like I was interacting with a living forest in the first game. It was just a good Metroidvania in some pretty environments. Now, we've got these little guys just, and you've got to try and help them save their home, and it's nice, and it's really sweet. And in a year where things have been a bit rubbish, just having the ability to move through this beautiful, lush landscape and help some cute creatures felt nice. And so, Ori and the Will of the Wisps is my favourite game of 2020 so far. And I say so far because there's a lot of games from 2020 that I've not yet played and definitely have on my radar. I want to play Ghost of Tsushima. I want to play Ghost Runner. There's a couple of other things. Haven looks really good. Spiritfarer, I hear, is really good as well. I want to kind of play all these things as well, but there just hasn't been the time to play all of them, unfortunately. But this, I hope, is a nice little representative look at the games that I played this year and how I felt about them in general. And I hope it's been entertaining for you. Let me know what your favourite games of the year were if anything, and whether you agree with my choices or not. And yeah, that is it for me right now. Next week, you will get a look at my favourite games that I played this year that are not from this year. They're from earlier years. That should be a fun one. It's going to be a top 12, I believe, because I just keep adding games to it. So by the time it comes out, it might not even be a top 12 anymore. It might be a top 20. Who knows? This started out as a top 10 with a bunch of extras, and then it became a top 20. So here we are. So thank you for joining me today, and welcome to 2021, everyone. Happy New Year, and I will see you again next week with even more games that we can celebrate. I'll see you then.